I showed up at my grandfather's apartment unannounced, and when he opened the door, his face was as white as a sheet. He grabbed my arm, pulled me inside, and whispered in a trembling voice, "Go to the kitchen, get under the table and don't make a sound." I thought he had lost his mind, but I obeyed. Then I heard my husband's footsteps in the hallway. What he said over the next 40 minutes destroyed everything I thought I knew about my own life. But before I continue, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. I was 40 years old when my life was split right down the middle, and I had to learn how to carry the half that was left in a completely new way. It wasn't a loud breakup, it wasn't an infidelity discovered on a cell phone, nor a screaming match in the middle of the living room with plates being thrown. It was silent, calculated like a crack that starts beneath the floorboards, and slowly creeps up until the day the ground completely caves in. And when the ground truly caved in, I was crouching beneath an antique mahogany in my grandfather's kitchen trying not to breathe too loudly. My name is Elena, and I'm an accounting assistant. I work at a mid-sized firm in downtown Seattle, and for 12 years I was Marcus's wife. 12 years. That's enough time to build habits, memories, a whole life of little routines that you don't even realize are life itself until they disappear. Waking up to the same breathing next to you, the smell of the dark roast drip coffee he made every morning at 7 a.m., always black, no sugar, the way he folded his towel after taking a shower, always in perfect thirds, as if there were a strict rule for it. I truly loved him. That has to be said because it makes it easier to understand the pain of what came next. I met Marcus at a company holiday party where I was working at the time. He had tagged along with a colleague, hardly knew anyone, and stayed in a corner with a craft beer watching people with this quiet, observant air that I mistook for depth. We exchanged numbers. 3 weeks later he called me. Within 4 months we were exclusively dating. 2 years later we got married. He worked in commercial sales, repping industrial equipment for mid-sized businesses. Sometimes he traveled, spending a few days out of town, but he always came back with funny stories from the road or a little souvenir bought at a gas station off I-5 down near Tacoma. Always wearing that smile that made me forget I had been alone. For 4 days. I never needed much to be happy. I wasn't into luxury, expensive trips or trendy restaurants. I liked being home, quiet weekends, a home-cooked dinner, a good series on Netflix, and Marcus, or at least the Marcus I thought I knew, seemed to enjoy the exact same things. My grandfather Arthur was the only real family I had left. My mother passed away when I was 22, cancer, fast and brutal, the kind that doesn't give you a chance for a proper goodbye. My father disappeared from my life long before that. He walked out when I was 16, turning into nothing more than a voice on the phone on Christmas, until eventually even that stopped. My grandfather was my anchor, the only fixed point around which the rest of my life revolved. Grandpa Arthur was 74 and lived alone in a condo he and my grandmother had bought in the 1980s in Queen Anne, an older solid brick building with thick walls and massive windows. My grandmother had died 11 years ago, and since then, he lived in that place with the same photos on the walls, the same dark wood furniture, the same smell of freshly brewed coffee, and the little lavender sachets he kept in the drawers. Just because my grandmother used to do it and he never broke the habit, it was a large place for one person, 3 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a kitchen with a solid mahogany table that could seat 8. It was in a prime location on a high floor overlooking a park, the kind of property that is worth a lot of money, which any real estate appraiser would call a highly privileged asset. I never thought of my grandfather's condo as an asset. I thought of it as the house where I learned to bake apple pie, the place where I slept on the couch during summer vacations as a kid, the place from which Grandpa Arthur called me the day my mom died, telling me simply that I could cry as much as I needed to because he wasn't going to hang up. Marcus thought differently. It just took me way too long to realize it. The first red flags were so subtle I mistook them for kindness. During our 2nd year of marriage, Marcus started visiting my grandfather more frequently. He would go without me asking, bringing him fresh fruit or donuts, sitting in the living room and talking at length with Arthur about baseball, politics, or how the city used to be. My grandfather liked him. He said Marcus was a good guy, polite, attentive, different from the men of younger generations who didn't know how to listen to their elders. My heart would swell whenever he said that. I should have paid closer attention to the types of questions Marcus was asking during those visits. At the time, I thought it was just natural curiosity. Only later did I understand he was gathering intelligence. The change in Marcus's behavior didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, the kind of shift you only notice when you look back and compare the person they used to be with the person they've become. By our 4th year of marriage, he started bringing up my grandfather's condo during dinners, always indirectly, always with the tone of someone being reasonable and practical. Your grandpa is getting older. That place is way too big for one person. Imagine if he falls or gets sick while he's all alone. I agreed that it was a legitimate concern. I suggested hiring a home health aide or having my grandfather come live with us for a while. Marcus would shake his head as if I were missing the point, which I'd understand much later, was something else entirely. He escalated his suggestions little by little. First, he talked about putting the condo in both of our names as a way to protect the family's asset. Then he suggested getting a broad power of attorney in his name to help with bureaucratic paperwork since it was getting harder for my grandfather to go to the bank. During a Saturday afternoon chat while I was folding laundry, he mentioned he had a buddy who was a real estate agent and could appraise the condo no strings attached, just so we had an idea of its current market value. I stopped him dead in his tracks at all those proposals. I don't know if it was pure instinct or my professional background. I've worked with numbers for years. I know how to spot when the math doesn't add up, and something inside me refused to swallow those suggestions as simple family courtesies. Marcus wouldn't push it in the moment. He changed the subject, stayed quiet, and I'd assume the matter was dead. But it would return weeks later repackaged in a new disguise. What I didn't know was that while I was closing the door on him at home, Marcus was opening another one directly at my grandfather's apartment. Grandpa Arthur told me months later exactly how things had gone down. Marcus would show up on weekdays, usually in the afternoons when he knew I was stuck at the accounting firm. He'd bring pastries, some sharp cheddar cheese, a bag of good coffee. He'd sit in the kitchen with my grandfather, talk about absolutely trivial things, and at the end of the visit, almost as an afterthought, he'd pull out some paper for my grandfather to sign, an authorization to receive mail, a contact update form for the HOA. Things that seemed strictly administrative routine of no real consequence. My grandfather signed the first few. He was 74, but he was completely sharp. He was a retired state auditor with 32 years of service under his belt. He knew how to read documents. It was just that his trust in his grandson-in-law fogged his vision like steam on a mirror until the day Marcus brought him a different piece of paper. My grandfather put on his reading glasses, read the first line, read the second, and stopped. He asked Marcus to explain what it was. Marcus explained it vaguely, rushing his words. He said it was just a legal formality, that all the properties in the county were going through an update in the public registry. My grandfather told him he was going to keep it and read it over carefully later. Marcus got anxious. He insisted he needed the document back that very same day. My grandfather said no. Marcus snatched the paper back and left without saying goodbye. That night my grandfather called his lifelong friend Henry, who had retired as a real estate attorney and understood deeds and paperwork better than anyone. He read the document to him over the phone. Henry stayed silent for a few seconds and then said with the calm voice of someone who has seen it all, "Art, that right there is a quick claim deed. If you sign that, you're transferring the title of your home entirely over to him." My grandfather hung up the phone. He sat in his kitchen chair for a long time, staring at the table where my grandmother had served dinner for 40 years, and he thought he didn't call me right then. He didn't want to scare me without being absolutely sure. He didn't want to make a mistake in his assessment before having all the evidence in hand. After all, he had been an auditor. He spent 2 more months gathering information, noting down dates, saving papers, consulting with Henry, and when he finally had the complete picture, he made a decision. He was going to wait, and when Marcus came back, he was going to record everything. I knew none of this the afternoon I went to my grandfather's house unannounced. I went because I had this heavy tightness in my chest that hadn't gone away for days, a murky feeling that something was wrong, even if I couldn't put a name to it. I went because I needed a strong cup of coffee and an honest, comfortable silence, the kind you only find in the home of someone who has known you since the day you were born. When my grandfather opened the door and went pale, my first reaction was to think he was having a medical emergency, but his eyes weren't the eyes of someone in physical pain. They were the eyes of someone who is afraid, yet fiercely determined. That strange combination that makes a person look fragile and dangerous at the same time. Get to the kitchen right now, under the table, and don't make a sound. He whispered it, grabbing my arm, yanking me inside before I'd even fully crossed the threshold. I obeyed. I didn't ask questions. There was something in his tone that left no room for them. The mahogany table in my grandfather's kitchen was massive. It always had been. When I was a little girl, I could almost stand up straight underneath it. Now at 40, I had to pull my knees to my chest and press my back against the cold wall to fit. It smelled like old wood and a faint trace of floor wax, the kind my grandfather stubbornly polished the floorboards with every single month just as my grandmother had taught him. I stayed perfectly still. My heart was racing at 1,000 miles an hour. The doorbell rang less than 3 minutes later. I heard my grandfather walk slowly down the hall, the slow shuffle of his slippers on the hardwood floor, the click of the deadbolt. The door opened, and then I heard a voice I knew better than my own. "Marcus, Arthur, good afternoon. I brought you some treats." His voice was exactly the same as the one he used with me during our early years, smooth, careful with that studied calmness I had confused with confidence. My grandfather told him to come in, that he was going to put the water on for coffee. I heard Marcus's heavy footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the floorboards under his weight, the rustle of a paper bakery bag being set on the living room table. My grandfather walked through the kitchen toward the stove very slowly. As he passed the gap where I was hiding, he tilted his head down slightly without stopping, without turning his face, and said, barely moving his lips, "He doesn't know you're here. Stay." One word. Stay. And I stayed. The first few minutes were entirely banal, the kind of chit-chat that makes you doubt your own instincts. Marcus asked about his blood pressure, his last doctor's appointment, if the new medication was working. My grandfather answered him calmly without rushing, giving absolutely no hint that someone was curled up in his kitchen listening to every syllable. Then the tone shifted. It wasn't a sudden jump, it was a gradual descent, like when the temperature drops, and you only realize it when you're already shivering. Marcus started talking about the property situation, about the maintenance costs of an older building, about the burden of keeping up such a large home without help. His voice was losing its smoothness, becoming drier, more direct. "Arthur, I need you to understand that I'm trying to help you. All this bureaucracy is Elle's fault. She has zero vision for wealth management. She doesn't understand business, she never has. But I do, and I know what needs to be done." I pressed my back against the wall harder. I felt the cold plaster through the fabric of my blouse. My grandfather replied slowly with the tone of someone who is in no rush because he knows time is on his side. He said he understood his concern, that he appreciated him looking out for him, but that the condo was his and any decisions regarding the place would be made by him alone. Marcus raised his voice slightly. He didn't quite yell, it was worse than a yell. It was that low, controlled voice of someone suppressing rage with immense effort. The kind of voice that slips out when the mask has worn too thin to hide what's underneath. "You're being stubborn, Arthur. I have very serious debts. Debts that affect Elle too, even if she doesn't know it. And if you would just help me right now, I could fix everything. The condo would be secured, Elle would be safe, and nobody would have to find out about any of this." I had to use every ounce of willpower not to move. Serious debts that affect Elle too. My grandfather stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he asked, using his old auditor voice, the one that had spent 30 years untangling lies buried in spreadsheets, "What debts are those, Marcus?" And Marcus started talking. I heard things from under that table that no wife should ever have to discover that way. But maybe there was no less brutal way to find out who Marcus really was. He had taken out loans from at least 4 different shady financial lenders over the last 3 years. He skimmed over the figures without getting into heavy details, but it was enough to mentally calculate that the total was well over $150,000. He had invested that money into shares of a commercial real estate project that had gone completely bankrupt. According to him, it was the fault of his partners who faked the appraisals. Now his creditors were coming after him. Some had already filed lawsuits, and for at least one of those loans, he had used our own condo as collateral, the home we bought together on a mortgage, which I thought was the one concrete thing we had built in our 12 years of marriage. I found out all of that right there, crouched on the cold floor, my chin trembling. But that wasn't the part that broke me inside. The part that shattered me into a million pieces was when my grandfather asked him directly, "And Elle, what did you plan to do with her in the middle of all this?" It took Marcus about 2 seconds to answer. And when he did, his voice was completely different. All that forced smoothness was gone. What remained was a coldness I had never heard from him before. Sharp and precise, like the edge of a straight razor. Elle was never the plan, Arthur. The plan was always the apartment. I needed someone who was the heir to a valuable piece of real estate. Someone who trusted me enough not to ask too many questions. She served that purpose well for a long time. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. For me, it lasted a lifetime. I bit my own fist, not out of anger, but from a pain that doesn't have a proper name. That agonizing realization that what you called love was in reality just a strategic position on a map you never even knew existed. 12 years. Every morning breakfast, every trip, every night he came home late. And I swallowed my complaints because I wanted to be the understanding wife. Every time I defended him to my best friend Clara when she told me something seemed off about him. Every decision I postponed, every dream I put on the back burner so as not to pressure him too much. All of it had been calculated by him as an investment. I was just the stepping stone to get to my grandfather. My grandfather remained quiet after those words. Then he spoke with that deep, deliberate voice of a man who doesn't need to raise his tone to be heard. Then I need you to understand one thing, Marcus, this apartment is not going to be yours, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. But what you just told me, that's officially on the record. Marcus asked him what he meant by that. And that was when I heard the sound, a tiny discreet sound coming from somewhere on the hallway console table. A little click. My grandfather had started a voice memo recording on his cell phone before Marcus walked in. And Marcus had just confessed to everything. Marcus realized he had said too much. I heard the immediate panic in his voice. His desperate attempt to backtrack, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a rush. He claimed he had misspoken. That he was under an insane amount of pressure. That the debts weren't letting him sleep. That the truth was he really did love Elle. That it had all just sounded wrong. My grandfather didn't respond to a single one of his excuses. He stayed absolutely silent, possessing that serenity that had always been his trademark. The calm of a man who spent decades listening to people try to explain away math that didn't add up, learning that silence is far more effective than any confrontation. That was when I crawled out from under the table. It wasn't a planned decision. It was my body acting before my brain could process it. My knees ached, my back was stiff, my face was soaked with tears I hadn't even realized I was shedding. I stood up, straightened my posture, and walked into the archway of the living room. Marcus was standing in the middle of the room when he saw me. His face rapidly cycled through a sequence of emotions. Shock, terror, that reflex attempt to smile that died before it even formed. He opened his arms in a welcoming gesture that looked entirely rehearsed. I didn't say anything right away. I stared at him for one long second. I looked at the man I had slept next to for 12 years, whose shirts I still laundered, whose struggles I had accepted without question, and I felt something very strange. It wasn't hatred. It was a kind of cold, total clarity. Like when a thick fog suddenly lifts, and you finally see the landscape exactly as it's always been. I heard everything I told him, my voice came out steady. That surprised me. He started trying to explain, to minimize, to reframe it. He said he had exaggerated, that he was hot-headed, that I had taken things out of context. I let him ramble for a few seconds, then I told him very calmly that I hadn't taken anything out of context, that I worked with numbers, that I knew how to verify information, and that in fact I had already mentally verified quite a bit. I mentioned the lenders, I mentioned the debts, I mentioned our own condo being put up as collateral behind my back. Marcus's face completely fell apart. His last attempt to look soft vanished. My grandfather, who had remained sitting quietly on the sofa this whole time, stood up slowly. He walked over to the console table, picked up his phone, and turned the screen toward Marcus. On the screen was the voice recorder app, the timer still ticking, over 50 minutes of audio. Marcus took a sudden step toward my grandfather. Fast, aggressive, his hand reaching out. In that movement there was a violent urgency that made me instantly tense up. That was when Henry stepped through the front door, which my grandfather had left unlatched. Henry, 72 years old, retired lawyer, holding a walking cane he didn't actually need, but carried purely out of habit. He had the posture of a man who spent decades being the highest authority in courtroom. He had been standing out in the hall listening, having coordinated with my grandfather from the beginning. He looked at Marcus with the absolute calm of someone who was utterly unimpressed and said very slowly, "Son, I heard everything from the door, and I've had the district attorney's personal cell phone number saved in my contacts since 1993. You take one more step, and I'm calling him right now." Marcus froze. He looked back and forth between us, me, my grandfather, Henry. Then he snatched his jacket off the back of the chair and stormed out without another word. He slammed the door so hard that flecks of paint chipped off the door frame. We listened to his footsteps rushing down the stairwell until they disappeared. Henry locked the deadbolt and engaged the chain. My grandfather sat back down on the sofa with his slow aging knees. I walked back into the kitchen, gripped the edge of the sink with both hands, and finally broke down, not screaming, just silently. My shoulders violently shaking, the tap water running aimlessly because I had turned it on without realizing it. My grandfather came into the kitchen, sat in the nearest chair, and put his hand on my shoulder. He stayed just like that, not saying a word while I cried out everything I had been holding in beneath that table. His hand was warm and heavy, and it smelled like those same lavender sachets as always. The very next day I was at family court before 8 a.m. I filed the divorce papers while still wearing the exact same coat I had on the night before, still with a smudge of floor wax on the elbow. Marcus called me that same day, then the next and the one after that. I actually answered the first few calls. He fluctuated wildly between a meek pleading voice and a sharp hostile one. Between "I'm so sorry" and accusations. Between "I love you, we can fix this," and "you're going to regret crossing me." After answering 3 times, I stopped. I started saving every voicemail, every text, taking screenshots with time and date stamps. My coworker Nancy, who had spent 20 years handling the financial side of messy divorces, helped me compile a sworn affidavit with the entire log of messages. It all became legal evidence before Marcus even realized he was building the case against himself. Then the creditors started calling. Unknown voices, sometimes aggressive, sometimes just utterly exhausted, saying Marcus had promised to pay them as soon as he sold a property, and they wanted to know when they'd see their money. I told every single one of them the exact same thing, never altering my tone. I am not a guarantor for my husband's obligations. We are in the middle of a divorce. All collections must be directed to him or handled through the legal system. Most of them hung up. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 months later. Marcus showed up with a young, arrogant attorney who tried to get the recording thrown out, arguing it was a violation of wiretapping laws and an invasion of privacy. My lawyer attorney Rachel, a woman in her late 50s with the kind of commanding voice that makes a whole room stop to listen, explained with surgical precision that the recording had been made by my grandfather inside his own private residence on his own device in a situation where he was facing extortion regarding his property. It wasn't unlawful surveillance, it was the legitimate self-defense of an elderly man documenting elder financial abuse and threats. The judge admitted the recording into evidence. The divorce decree was issued. I got to keep our condo, taking into account that Marcus had hidden massive debts, fraudulently leveraged marital assets behind my back, and proven in his own recorded words that his intentions in the marriage were fundamentally fraudulent. He appealed the decision and lost. The creditors eventually tracked him down on their own. With no access to any property, no verifiable income, and no partner left to believe his lies, Marcus was left completely alone to carry that crushing weight. One of the lenders repossessed his car. His friends slowly distanced themselves as the full story leaked out. A few months later, I heard he had packed up and moved out of state. I didn't care to know anything more than that. The first few weeks after the divorce were the strangest. I would come home to my 2-bedroom condo, and I didn't recognize the silence. Before, the silence was tense, the kind that sits around waiting for something bad to happen. Now it was different, it was expansive. The kind of silence where you can take a deep breath without feeling like you're bothering someone. I started noticing little things about myself that had vanished without me realizing. That I actually preferred my morning coffee with milk, not the black drip coffee I had adopted out of pure habit. That I loved sleeping with the bedroom window cracked open even in the freezing Seattle winter. That I didn't need to ask anyone's permission to go visit my grandfather on a random Wednesday night. It seems like small stuff, but all those tiny details added up to an entire life I had been living sideways for 12 years. The first real step I took was securing my grandfather's apartment. I went over there with a folder full of legal documents and my laptop. We sat down at the mahogany kitchen table, the exact same one I had huddled beneath during the most defining 50 minutes of my life, and we worked for 2 days straight. We drafted a living trust and a life estate deed with an attorney guaranteeing his absolute right to live there for the rest of his life. We updated all the property paperwork, regularized the title, and registered the property in the county's real estate fraud alert system. Now any attempted transaction or lien placed on that apartment would trigger an immediate alert to my phone and email. Henry paid us a visit while we were sorting the papers out. He looked at the table covered in documents, looked at my grandfather with his reading glasses perched on his nose reviewing every clause, and looked at me crossing tasks off a checklist with my pen. He said, with the brevity of an old dog who's seen it all, "Well, now things are finally exactly as they should be." Later, while we were drinking coffee. He added something that stuck in my head for weeks. Elle, how many women do you think are out there who have gone through the exact same thing as you, but don't have your background, who don't even know where to begin, who don't have a grandfather sharp enough to trap a predator on tape? How many elderly folks are sitting alone in their homes, terrified of their own family members, and have no idea what to do with that fear? I kept thinking about that at work. At the accounting firm, there were 2 associates who occasionally handled family estate protection cases. I heard them every day talking about cases identical to mine, but looking at them from the outside, treating them as case files, as numbers, as folders, I looked at those stories and I finally understood them from the inside. 8 months after my divorce was finalized, I quit my job. I opened my own consulting firm focused entirely on asset protection, financial literacy, and legal advocacy for seniors and their families. I found a tiny office space on the ground floor of a commercial building. I renovated it myself with the little savings I had left. I painted the walls a warm beige and bought a very plush, comfortable sofa for the waiting area, specifically chosen so my elderly clients could sit without their joints aching. On the front door, I hung a simple brass plaque with the firm's name and below it the words Asset Protection and Elder Rights Advocacy. Word-of-mouth recommendations among older women are more effective than any multi-million-dollar marketing campaign. One woman told her neighbor, the neighbor told her friend at water aerobics, that friend mentioned it to her daughter-in-law. Within 3 months I was seeing 4 to 5 clients a day. My grandfather would sometimes come spend the afternoon at my office. He'd sit on the waiting room sofa, drink the fresh coffee I always kept brewing, flip through a magazine, or just sit quietly watching me. He never said out loud what I could clearly read in his eyes when he watched me work. When I was patiently explaining dense paperwork to an elderly woman who had walked in shaking with anxiety, or when I was aggressively arguing on the phone with a title company to untangle a mess for a client who didn't know their left from their right, I saw his look, and it was the kind of gaze that is worth more than 1,000 words. One night, after locking up the office and turning off the lights, I called him from the sidewalk outside. I asked him if he remembered the day he had yanked me inside and ordered me to get under the kitchen table. He laughed, that short, dry chuckle of a man who has lived long enough to laugh at serious things. I asked him how he had even come up with the idea to hide me there instead of just telling me to leave. He went quiet for a second. Then he told me it had been very simple. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he knew I needed to know the truth, but not from someone else telling me. I needed to hear it straight from the mouth of the person who was hiding it from me. If I had just told you the story, you probably would have doubted me. But if you heard it with your own 2 ears, there was no way you could ever doubt it. So I let you listen. I stood in silence outside my office, looking up at the brass plaque illuminated by the street lamp. Thanks, Grandpa, I said. For what? For the table. Yeah, for the table, for it being big enough for me to fit underneath. He laughed again and I laughed with him. For the first time in a very long time, I laughed in a completely light-hearted way without feeling like I had a heavy anchor tied to my throat. I hung up, slipped my phone into my coat pocket and walked toward my car. The air was crisp, it smelled like wet asphalt and rain. That unmistakable scent of late evening in a sprawling city that never stops moving. And I walked slowly with no rush, with nowhere I needed to escape to and no one I needed to hide from. It was just me, the night air, and a life that had finally truly begun to belong to me. Now if you like this story, hit the subscribe button, and let me know in the comments which part left you completely speechless. Oh, and don't forget to become a member for access to exclusive videos I don't post anywhere else. I'll see you there. Disclaimer. This video is created for the sole purpose of entertainment. All situations, characters, and stories in this video are fictional and are built entirely using artificial intelligence technology. We hope you have a relaxing time.